August 18th, 1944. Camp Concordia, Kansas. The sun hammered down on corrugated tin roofs until even the shadows shimmered with heat. Margaret Fisher stood behind the barbed wire fence, hands clasped behind her back in the posture of an officer, though she no longer commanded anyone. At 28 years old, she had already lived 3 lifetimes. The first ended when her father died in the Dresden bombings. The second ended when her transport ship crossed the Atlantic in chains. The third was beginning now behind these fences in the middle of nowhere America, watching enemy soldiers do something that made absolutely no sense. They were roasting corn, whole ears of it, husks still clinging to the kernels, blackening over improvised grills. The smoke rose lazy and sweet into the merciless Kansas sky. Greta watched with the clinical detachment she had learned as a signals officer, cataloging every detail as if for a report. The American soldiers laughed as they worked. Their sleeves were rolled to the elbows. Sweat darkened their olive shirts. They moved with the casual confidence of men who had never known real hunger. Behind her, Katharina Vogel whispered in clipped German, her voice carrying the bite of contempt. Das ist Tierfutter, animal feed, pig fodder, the kind of thing you chopped up and threw into troughs for livestock. In Germany, corn was silage. It was peasant food, something no educated woman of the Reich would dare touch. Greta had grown up in Göttingen, daughter of a professor of agricultural science at the university. She had eaten at tables where the conversation was Kant and Goethe, where the bread was dark rye with proper butter, where everything had its place in the natural order of civilization. Corn belonged to animals. That was simply fact. Yet here were these Americans treating it like a delicacy, turning it over the flames with the same care her mother once used preparing Sunday roast. The paradox was almost offensive. The woman beside her, Katharina, was 32 and sharp as broken glass. She had worked in military intelligence before capture, and even now, even here, she carried herself like someone keeping score. Her eyes were always watching, always calculating. When she smiled, which was rare, it never reached those eyes. They fed this to pigs in Bavaria. Katharina continued, her voice pitched just loud enough for the other women to hear. And now they expect us to eat it like civilized people. Americans, what did we expect? A few nervous laughs rippled through the group. 17 German women, all officers or specialists, all captured in the chaotic final months as the Reich's Atlantic defenses crumbled. They stood in a loose cluster near the fence, their threadbare uniforms marking them as something between soldiers and prisoners. The American guards let them gather like this during the day. There was nowhere to run. The Kansas prairie stretched flat and endless in every direction, broken only by fields of wheat and corn that seemed to go on forever. Greta said nothing. She had learned that silence was safer than speech. Since arriving at Camp Concordia 3 weeks ago, she had watched Katharina carefully. The woman was dangerous not because of physical strength, but because she believed. Even now, even after everything, Katharina believed in the 1,000-year Reich, believed in final victory, believed that surrender was temporary and retribution would come. Greta was no longer sure what she believed. The smell reached them first. Not the harsh smoke of burning, but something else underneath. Something that made Greta's stomach clench despite herself. Sweet, roasted, almost like chestnuts at Christmas markets before the war, when there were still chestnuts and markets and Christmas. One of the American sergeants approached the fence. He was older than the others, maybe 35, with the kind of weathered face that came from years working outdoors. His uniform was pressed despite the heat. When he spoke, his voice carried easily across the distance. Good afternoon, ladies. Perfect German. Not the awkward textbook German of someone who learned it in school, but fluent, native-sounding German with just a hint of Swabian accent underneath. Several women gasped. Greta felt something cold settle in her chest. The sergeant smiled, not unkindly. My name is Thomas Weber. My grandparents came from Stuttgart in 1870. I grew up speaking German at home. So if any of you need anything, you can ask me in your own language. No need for broken English. Katharina stepped forward, her spine rigid. We need nothing from you, she said in German, her voice ice. Weber's smile didn't waver. Fair enough. But just so you know, dinner tonight is special. Cultural exchange, they're calling it. You'll eat with us. At tables. Real food. And yes, he gestured to the grills that includes the corn. I know what you're thinking. I know what corn means in Germany, but I'm asking you to trust me for just one bite, just one, because that one bite will change how you see everything." He turned and walked back to the grills, leaving the words hanging in the hot air. Katerina made a sound of disgust. "Propaganda," she hissed. "They want to soften us, make us forget who we are." But an older woman, Liesel Hartmann, spoke up quietly. Liesel was 45, a nurse who had lost both sons in the war. She had the kind of tired eyes that had seen too much death. "What if he's right, though? What if we've been wrong about something as simple as corn?" Katharina rounded on her. "Wrong, we are German. We invented half of modern science. We perfected agriculture while these people were still shooting each other over cattle. And you want to take lessons from them about food?" Liesel looked away, but Greta saw something in the nurse's face. Something that looked like doubt, or perhaps just exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that came from holding on to certainty when the world kept proving you wrong. That evening, as the sun began its slow descent toward the flat horizon, the prisoners were led to long wooden tables set up in the mess yard. This was unprecedented. Usually they ate from tin trays, standing or sitting on benches guarded and separate. But tonight, American soldiers sat among them. The tables were laid with actual plates, cloth napkins, lanterns strung overhead swaying slightly in the prairie wind. The food came out on wooden platters. Greta stared. Corn, mountains of it, golden ears glistening with melted butter, but also cornbread cut into thick squares that steamed when they were broken open. Corn pudding creamy and flecked with kernels. Something called spoon bread that looked impossibly light. And fried chicken, which Sergeant Weber explained had been fed on corn its entire life. The smell was overwhelming. Not the thin, watery smell of camp rations. Not the harsh smell of ersatz bread made with sawdust filler. This was rich, buttery, sweet, and savory at once. Greta's mouth watered despite every instinct telling her to refuse. Katerina sat rigid, arms crossed. "I will not eat animal feed," she announced. Weber, sitting across from her, picked up an ear of corn. He peeled back the husk, carefully revealing the perfect rows of kernels underneath. Steam rose from it. Butter ran down his fingers. "This corn," he said quietly, "was bred by the Iowa Agricultural Extension over 20 years. It's called Golden Bantam. Each kernel has been selected for sweetness, for texture, for the way it tastes when roasted. The indigenous peoples of this continent developed corn from a wild grass over 5,000 years. What you call animal feed is actually one of the most sophisticated crops in human history. Your ancestors, Ms. Vogel, were still figuring out wheat when the Mayans were building pyramids from corn surplus." He offered the ear across the table. "One bite, that's all I ask. If you hate it, I'll personally apologize." Katerina stared at him with open hatred, but another woman, younger, reached out and took a different ear from the platter. Her name was Annalise. She had been a clerk, quiet and unremarkable until now. She bit into the corn before anyone could stop her. The crack was audible, the snap of kernel against teeth, then silence as she chewed, her eyes going wide. "Es ist süß," she whispered. "It's sweet." The word hung in the air like an accusation. Sweet, not bitter, not harsh, not the tough, fibrous corn they had imagined. Sweet. Other hands reached out, tentative at first, then more confident. Greta watched as women who had sworn never to touch American food began pulling ears from the pile. Butter dripped onto the rough wooden table. Salt crystals caught the lantern light. The sound of eating replaced the sound of protest. Greta held out as long as she could. Pride was a kind of armor, and she had worn it so long she forgot it could be removed. But hunger was older than pride. Curiosity was stronger than ideology. And the smell, God, the smell was impossible to ignore. She lifted an ear of corn. It was heavier than she expected, warm against her palm. She peeled back the husk the way she had seen Weber do it, revealing the perfect golden kernels beneath. For a moment she hesitated. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Corn is a low-grade crop, Margaret, suitable only for the New World where they lack sophistication." She bit down. The world stopped. It was not animal feed. It was not coarse or bitter or crude. It was sunlight condensed into flavor. The kernel burst against her teeth, releasing sweetness that was nothing like beet sugar or honey. This was something else entirely. Roasted caramel, butter and smoke, salt and earth and summer all at once. The texture was tender, almost delicate, nothing like the tough silage corn she had imagined. Greta closed her eyes. In that moment, she understood what Weber had meant. This one bite had changed everything. Because if they were wrong about corn, what else had they been wrong about? She opened her eyes to find Weber watching her. He didn't smile or gloat. He just nodded slightly, as if to say, I know. I understand. Across the table, Katerina sat frozen, watching the other women eat, with an expression that mixed disgust and something else. Fear, maybe, or the beginning of doubt. Liesel, the nurse, had tears running down her weathered face. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, as if storing the memory for later. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. 6 months, she said. 6 months I've been a prisoner. This is the first time I've tasted something that reminded me there's still goodness in the world. Greta reached for the cornbread. It was still warm, the crust golden and crisp. When she broke it open, steam rose, carrying the scent of butter and grain. The interior was soft, almost cake-like, but with a texture that was somehow both light and substantial. She spread butter on it, watching it melt into the yellow crumb. The first bite was a revelation. In Germany, bread was rye, dark, dense filling. It was serious bread that meant survival through winter. This cornbread was different. It was joyful. It tasted like abundance, like a country that had never known real hunger. Greta thought about the bread rations in Germany. By 1944, the official allotment was 200 grams per day. The bread itself was only 55% wheat. The rest was barley, oats, and yes, sawdust. She had eaten that bread and called it patriotic sacrifice. She had eaten it and told herself it was enough. But this was what bread could be when there was no scarcity. When the fields produced more than anyone needed. When butter was something you could use generously instead of rationing by the gram. The statistics Weber had mentioned earlier echoed in her mind. America produced nearly 3 billion bushels of corn annually, more than half the world's production. Kansas alone dedicated over 7 million acres to the crop. Germany, by contrast, struggled to produce enough rye to feed its population even before the war. The paradox was crushing. They had called Americans crude, unsophisticated, a nation of farmers who didn't understand true culture. But these farmers had mastered abundance in a way German science never had. They had turned a native grass into an empire of food. Sergeant Weber stood and cleared his throat. The conversations quieted. I want to tell you something, he said in German. His voice was gentle but firm. When my brother died at Normandy, I was angry. I wanted revenge. I wanted every German soldier to suffer the way he suffered. But then I remembered what my grandmother used to say. She said, Thomas, hate is easy. Any fool can hate. But to feed your enemy, that takes strength. He gestured to the tables, the food the women eating. You are not our enemies anymore. You are prisoners, yes, but you are also human beings. And human beings deserve to eat good food, to taste something sweet, to remember that the world is bigger than war. Katerina stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the ground. This is manipulation, she said, her voice shaking. You give us food, make us comfortable, and then what? We forget who we are. We forget our duty to the fatherland. Weber looked at her with something like pity. Ms. Vogel, I'm not asking you to forget anything. I'm asking you to eat corn. That's all. Just eat the corn, and maybe, just maybe, ask yourself if everything you were told was true. Katerina turned and walked away from the table, her back rigid with fury. 3 other women followed her. But the rest stayed. 13 women sitting at wooden tables with American soldiers eating corn and cornbread and letting themselves taste something they had been taught to despise. Greta ate until she was full. Not camp ration full, but actually full. Her stomach felt heavy in a way it hadn't since before the war. The sensation was almost uncomfortable. In Germany, fullness was a memory. Here it was just Thursday dinner. After the meal, as the lanterns burned lower and the night air cooled, Greta walked back to the barracks in silence. The other women chattered nervously, processing what had happened. Some laughed, some cried. All of them were confused. Inside the long wooden building that served as their quarters, Greta sat on her narrow cot and pulled out her journal. The pages were thin rationed like everything else. She had to write small to make it last. By the light of a single bulb, she began to write. August 18th, 1944. Today I ate corn, animal feed, pig fodder. Except it wasn't. It was sweet, It was tender. It tasted like summer in Rhineland before the war when things were simple and good. Sergeant Weber said one bite would change everything. He was right. I can't stop thinking about it. Not the taste, though, that was remarkable, but what it means. If we were wrong about corn, what else were we wrong about? Father used to say German science would feed the world, but we're starving. And the enemy has so much food, they feed it to their pigs and their chickens and still have enough to roast it over open flames for prisoners. Is this what defeat looks like? Not violence, but abundance. Not cruelty, but kindness. I don't know what to feel. I only know that I'm full for the first time in months, and it frightens me more than hunger ever did. She closed the journal and lay back on the cot, staring at the ceiling. Through the thin walls, she could hear whispered conversations. Some women were excited. Others were ashamed. All of them were changing whether they wanted to or not. In the darkness, a voice hissed from across the room. Greta Fisher. It was Katerina. Greta could see her silhouette sitting upright on her own cot. You ate it, Katerina said. You ate their food. You smiled. Greta sat up slowly. I was hungry, Katerina. We're all hungry. Hunger is no excuse for betrayal. Betrayal, Greta felt anger rising in her chest. We're prisoners of war, Katerina. They have every right to let us starve. Instead, they fed us better than our own government fed us in the last year. Lower your voice, Katerina snapped. Others are listening. Good, Greta said, not lowering her voice at all. Let them listen. Let them hear that we've been lied to about everything. She heard movement. Other women sitting up, paying attention now. Katerina stood, her posture threatening, even in the dim light. You will regret this, she said quietly. When we return to Germany, when this war is won and we go home, you will regret every word. Greta lay back down, turning her face to the wall. Go to sleep, Katerina. The war is already lost. You just don't know it yet. The silence that followed was brittle and dangerous. Greta listened to her own heartbeat, wondering if she had just made a terrible mistake. Katerina was not someone who forgave. She was someone who remembered. And in the right memory was often followed by punishment. But Greta was too tired to care, too full to be afraid. For the first time since her father died, since the bombs fell, since the transport ship brought her here, she felt something other than grief. She felt full, and somehow that was enough. The next morning arrived with the brutal efficiency of Kansas summer. By 6 a.m., the barracks were already stifling. Greta woke to find Katerina gone along with her 3 closest followers. The rest of the women were quiet, moving through their morning routines with the careful neutrality of people trying not to take sides. At breakfast, the corn appeared again, this time as cornmeal porridge, thick and golden, served with milk and a touch of honey. Greta ate it mechanically, tasting without really tasting. Her mind was elsewhere. After breakfast, Sergeant Weber appeared at the barracks door. Volunteers needed, he announced in German. We're taking a group to see the demonstration garden. 10 women. Anyone interested? Greta's hand went up before she could think about it. So did Liesel's. 8 others followed. Katerina and her group were conspicuously absent. They were let out through the main gate the first time Greta had been outside the wire since arriving. The prairie opened up around them, vast and overwhelming. The sky was impossibly big, unmarked by the smoke or searchlights or bomber contrails. Just blue, endless blue, and the green of growing things. The demonstration garden was a quarter-mile from the main camp. It wasn't large, maybe half an acre, but it was meticulously organized. Rows of different crops, each labeled with small wooden signs. Tomatoes, beans, squash, and corn. So much corn. A man in civilian clothes waited for them. He introduced himself as Mr. Harrison from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. He spoke no German, so Weber translated. This garden exists to show you what American agriculture has accomplished, Harrison began. Not to brag, not to make you feel bad, but to demonstrate that food security is possible with the right techniques. He led them to the corn section. 3 different varieties grew side by side. The first was tall, over 6 feet, with thick stalks and large ears. This is field corn, Harrison explained through Weber. It's what you probably think of when you think of American corn. We use it for animal feed, yes, but also for cornmeal, corn oil, corn syrup, and industrial alcohol. Nothing is wasted. The second variety was shorter, with smaller, tighter ears. This is sweet corn. What you ate last night. Bred specifically for human consumption. Higher sugar content. Tender kernels. Harvested young and eaten fresh. The third was different again. Small, compact ears with kernels that looked hard as stones. Popcorn. Ancient variety. The indigenous peoples used it for ceremonies and snacks. When heated, the moisture inside the kernel turns to steam and the whole thing explodes. He demonstrated shaking kernels in a pan over a small fire. Within minutes, white puffs filled the pan. He salted them and passed them around. The women ate cautiously at first, then with genuine delight. The popcorn was light, crispy, salty, nothing like any food they had known. Greta watched the corn plants swaying in the breeze. Each stalk represented years of selective breeding, scientific agriculture, patient improvement. She thought about her father, who had dismissed American farming as crude and simplistic. Had he ever actually studied it? Or had he just assumed European superiority? Harrison continued talking about hybrid seeds, about the revolution in corn yields that began in the 1920s. How farmers had doubled production in less than 2 decades through careful crossbreeding and selection. In 1920, he said American farms averaged about 26 bushels per acre. By 1940, we hit 31. Some farms are getting 40 now, and we're still improving. Weber added his own translation along with context. German farms average about 15 bushels per acre, and that's with intensive labor. The gap isn't just productivity, it's efficiency, mechanization, scientific agriculture applied at scale. Greta felt something crack inside her chest. It was the sound of certainty breaking. All her life she had been taught that German Wissenschaft, German science, was superior to anything the world could produce, that German precision and discipline would always triumph. But here was evidence growing in neat rows under the Kansas sun that they had been surpassed, not by force but by patient improvement. One of the other women asked a question. Why didn't anyone tell us? Why didn't we know about this? Weber's expression was sad. Because your leaders didn't want you to know. It's easier to make people fight if they think they're superior, if they think the enemy is weak and stupid. But the truth is complicated. The truth is that every nation has things to teach and things to learn. Your scientists gave the world quantum mechanics and organic chemistry. Ours gave the world hybrid corn and assembly line manufacturing. There's no shame in that, only shame in refusing to see it. They spent 2 hours in the garden, touching plants, asking questions, taking notes in the margins of whatever paper they could find. Greta memorized everything: the spacing between corn rows, the depth of planting, the rotation schedule that alternated corn with soybeans to restore nitrogen to the soil. When they returned to camp, Katharina was waiting. She stood near the gate, arms crossed, watching them approach with cold eyes. So she called out in German, "How was your little field trip? Did the Americans teach you how to be good little farmers?" Greta stopped in front of her. "They taught us how they feed their nation," she said evenly. "Something we apparently forgot how to do." Katerina's hand moved so fast Greta barely saw it. The slap caught her across the cheek, sharp and stinging. The other women gasped. Weber moved forward, but Greta held up her hand. "It's fine," she said. She touched her face, feeling the heat. Then she looked at Katerina. "Is that all you have left, violence? Because you can't argue with corn growing in the ground. You can't debate statistics. You can only hit people who tell you things you don't want to hear." Katerina's face was white with fury. "You will pay for this," she hissed, "when we return to the fatherland. When Germany rises again. You will pay." Liesel stepped between them, her nurse's authority cutting through the tension. "Enough, both of you. We're all prisoners here. Fighting each other won't change that." But the damage was done. Greta could see it in the eyes of the other women. They were choosing sides now. Some looked at Katerina with approval. Others looked at Greta with something like hope. The camp was dividing and corn was somehow the fault line. That night, Greta couldn't sleep. She lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of women breathing, shifting, occasionally crying quietly. Her cheeks still throbbed where Katerina had struck her. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the turmoil in her mind. Everything she had believed was suspect now. If they had been wrong about corn, what about the war itself? What about the promises of victory? What about the 1,000-year Reich? She thought about her father, brilliant and proud, who had taught her that German culture was the pinnacle of human achievement. Who had explained patiently and with perfect logic why some races were superior to others, why some nations deserved to rule, why sacrifice was necessary for the greater good. Had he believed it, or had he just been afraid to question? Greta didn't know. She only knew that she couldn't unknow what she had learned today. Couldn't unfeel the fullness in her belly. Couldn't unhear Weber's quiet voice explaining that hate was easy, but feeding your enemy took strength. Somewhere in the barracks she heard whispered conversation. Katerina's voice, low and urgent, talking to her followers, planning something. Greta closed her eyes and tried not to listen, tried not to imagine what came next. Tomorrow, Weber had said they would visit an actual farm, a real working farm run by a German-American family named Schmidt. 20 women would go. Greta would serve as translator. It was an honor, Weber said, a sign of trust. But Greta knew it was also a test, not of language skills, but of loyalty. The question was loyalty to what? To the Reich that had sent her to war and then forgotten her, or to the truth that kept revealing itself in the taste of sweet corn and the mathematics of hybrid yields. She didn't have an answer. Not yet. But morning was coming, whether she was ready or not. And with it, another choice. Another step away from everything she had once believed. The corn had changed everything, just like Weber promised. Now Greta had to decide what to do about it. In the darkness, she whispered a prayer. Not to God exactly, more to her father's ghost. To the memory of who she used to be. Forgive me, she whispered. Forgive me for doubting, for questioning, for tasting the enemy's food and finding it good. No answer came. Only silence in the slow approach of dawn and the knowledge that tomorrow she would step through that gate again and learn something else that would break her certainty a little more. The corn was just the beginning. The real harvest was still ahead. The truck rattled along the dirt road like a tin can filled with stones. Greta sat by the window watching the Kansas landscape unfold in endless variations of the same theme. Corn, wheat, more corn. The fields stretched to the horizon in every direction, broken only by occasional farmhouses that looked tiny and isolated against the vastness of the prairie. The road itself was unpaved, sending up plumes of dust that hung in the morning air like ghosts. 20 women sat in the truck bed, divided into two groups, as clearly as if someone had drawn a line down the middle. On one side, Greta and her followers. 13 women who had eaten the corn and attended the garden demonstration and begun asking questions that had no safe answers. On the other side, Katerina and 6 loyalists who sat rigid and silent, their faces set in expressions of contempt. The drive took 40 minutes. Nobody spoke. The only sounds were the engine's laboring growl, the creak of old suspension, and the wind rushing past. Greta held on to the side rail and thought about the letter she had written last night. A letter to her friend Marie in Munich. A letter she knew would be censored, delayed, possibly never delivered. But she had written it anyway, trying to explain the inexplicable. Dear Marie, we are eating better as prisoners than we ever ate as free women in the Reich. Does that frighten you as much as it frightens me? Beside her, Liesel sat with eyes closed, face turned toward the sun. The nurse had barely spoken since yesterday's confrontation. But when the truck hit a particularly rough patch and Greta grabbed the rail harder, Liesel's hand found hers and squeezed once. Solidarity without words. Katerina's voice cut through the engine noise, pitched just loud enough to carry. Look at them. So eager to visit the enemy. So ready to forget who they are. Greta didn't turn around. Didn't take the bait. She had learned something important in the last few days. Katerina needed conflict the way plants needed water. She fed on it, grew stronger from it. The only way to win was not to fight. But inside, Greta's stomach churned, not from the rough road, but from anticipation and dread mixed together. They were going to the Schmidt farm. Weber had explained it last night. Wilhelm Schmidt, 3rd generation, German-American. 300 acres. Corn and wheat, mostly some livestock. His wife Martha was from the old country, immigrated in 1920. They spoke German at home. They had volunteered to host the prisoners for a workday. Volunteered. That word stuck in Greta's mind. Who volunteered to feed their enemy, who opened their home to the very people whose nation had tried to conquer the world. The truck slowed, turned down a narrower lane. Trees appeared, the first real trees Greta had seen since arriving in Kansas. Cottonwoods, Weber had called them. They lined a driveway that led to a white farmhouse with a wide porch and actual flower boxes in the windows. Behind it, a massive red barn. Beyond that, fields that seemed to go on forever. The truck stopped. Weber jumped down first, then helped the women climb out. Greta's legs were stiff from sitting. She stretched carefully, feeling her spine crack. The air here smelled different than at camp. Cleaner somehow, like growing things and earth and possibility. An older man came out of the house, wiping his hands on his trousers. He was maybe 55, barrel-chested, with a weathered face and bright blue eyes. When he spoke, his voice carried the same Swabian accent Greta remembered from her father's colleague at the university. Willkommen, welcome. I am Wilhelm Schmidt. My wife Martha is inside preparing the lunch. You must be tired from the journey. Please, there is water. There is shade. Make yourselves comfortable. The accent was so familiar it made Greta's throat tight. This man's grandparents had probably walked the same streets in Stuttgart that her own family had walked, had probably eaten the same foods, sung the same songs, believed in the same God. And yet somewhere in the last 70 years, their paths had diverged so completely that now they stood on opposite sides of a war. Wilhelm's eyes scanned the group, taking in their threadbare uniforms, their wary postures. When his gaze landed on Greta, something shifted in his expression. You are the translator, yes. Margaret Fisher. Greta nodded, suddenly unable to speak. Good, come. Let me show you what we do here. He turned and walked toward the barn without waiting to see if they would follow. After a moment's hesitation, Greta moved. The other women came after her in a loose group, all except Katerina, who stood by the truck with arms crossed, watching like a judge preparing to deliver sentence. The barn was enormous inside. Cathedral ceilings with old wooden beams that must have been cut from trees long before Greta was born. The space was organized with military precision. Tools hung on one wall, each in its designated place. Sacks of seed were stacked on wooden pallets. And in the back, machinery that made Greta stop and stare. A combine harvester. She had seen pictures in her father's agricultural journals, but never the real thing. It was massive, all steel and rubber and mechanical promise. Wilhelm walked to it and patted the side affectionately, the way someone might pat a favorite horse. She is beautiful. No, bought her in 1940. Cost me $1,800, which I did not have. So I borrowed from the bank. 5-year loan. That first harvest she paid for herself. Now she harvests 30 acres a day, cuts the wheat, threshes, it cleans it, bags it. One machine does the work of 50 men. He looked at Greta, his expression serious. You understand what this means. This is not about being lazy. This is about being smart. When you do not have to spend all day bent over with a scythe, you have time for other things. You have time to improve your soil, time to study new techniques, time to read to your children at night. Machines do not replace humanity. They free it. Greta translated carefully, watching the faces of the other women as they absorbed this. Several were nodding, a few looked troubled. Back by the truck, Katharina's voice carried clearly. Machines replace men. This is the dehumanization of labor. Typical American thinking. Wilhelm heard her. He smiled slightly. Tell your friend she is welcome to harvest 30 acres by hand. I will provide the scythe. We can see how long her philosophy lasts in the August sun. Greta didn't translate that. Instead, she asked a question that had been burning in her mind since yesterday. Herr Schmidt, how many acres do you farm? 300. Though I rent another 100 from my neighbor when his health is poor. 400 acres. Greta did the mental arithmetic. The average German farm was 30 acres. Most were smaller. Her father had considered 50 acres to be a large operation. But 400, that was an estate. That was something only nobility owned in the old country. And you work it yourself, just you and your wife, Wilhelm laughed. Myself, my wife, 2 hired men during harvest, in the machines' POWs. The machines do most of the work. I am the supervisor. They walked through the barn and out into the fields beyond. The corn was nearly ready for harvest, the stalks tall and thick, the ears heavy and full. Wilhelm stopped at the edge of one field and crouched down, picking up a handful of soil. He let it run through his fingers. This soil was nothing when my grandfather bought this land, prairie grass and hard clay. But we worked it. Corn 1 year, then soybeans, then wheat. 3-year rotation. The soybeans fix nitrogen back into the earth. The wheat gives the soil a rest from heavy feeding crops. The corn produces the most, but it takes the most. You have to give back what you take. This is the secret. Not force, not exploitation. Partnership with the land. He stood brushing his hands off. Your father was a professor. Yes. At Göttingen, Greta felt her stomach drop. You know about my father, Weber told me. Agricultural science. A respected man. Wilhelm paused, choosing his words carefully. I read some of his papers. Before the war. Very theoretical. Very elegant. But I wonder, did he ever get his hands dirty? Did he ever actually plant a seed and watch it grow? Greta wanted to defend her father's memory. Wanted to explain that academic research was just as valid as practical farming. But the words wouldn't come, because the truth was her father had spent more time in libraries than in fields, had theorized about agriculture without ever really practicing it. Wilhelm seemed to understand her silence. Come, Martha will have lunch ready, and I promise you it will be better than theory. The farmhouse kitchen was everything Greta's childhood memories of home had once been. Large wooden table, windows open to let in the breeze, curtains that moved gently in the air, the smell of baking bread, and Martha Schmidt, a woman in her early 50s, with kind eyes and flour-dusted hands. She looked up as they entered, and her face broke into a smile. Ah, guests, please sit. I have made too much food as always. Wilhelm says I cook like we still have 6 children at home, instead of 6 children grown and gone. The table was set with care. Real plates, not military issue. Cloth napkins. Glasses already filled with cold water. And food. So much food. Cornbread still steaming from the oven. Fried chicken that glistened with grease and promise. Corn pudding in a large ceramic dish. Something called coleslaw, which Martha explained was shredded cabbage in a sweet, tangy dressing. Buttermilk in a pitcher. Butter in a ceramic crock. Green beans cooked with bacon. The women stood awkwardly, not sure if this was real or some kind of trap. Martha gestured impatiently. Sit, sit, food gets cold. And in this house, we do not waste food by letting it sit. Slowly, they took their seats. Greta found herself next to Wilhelm at one end of the table. Liesel sat across from her. The others filled in the remaining chairs. Through the window, Greta could see Katerina and her followers still standing by the truck, refusing to come inside. Martha brought more food from the kitchen. A pie, she announced, made from rhubarb in the garden. And coffee. Real coffee, not the acorn substitute Greta had been drinking for 2 years. When everyone was seated, Wilhelm bowed his head. We give thanks for this food, for this land, for this company, and we pray for peace for all people, even those we do not understand. Amen. It was the simplest prayer Greta had ever heard. No appeals to national glory, no petitions for victory, just thanks and a hope for peace. Something about it made her eyes burn. She picked up a piece of cornbread. It was still warm enough that the butter melted instantly when she spread it on. The first bite was just as good as she remembered from that first night. Maybe better because now she knew what to expect. Knew that this wasn't propaganda or trickery. This was just food honestly made, generously shared. Wilhelm spoke as they ate, his voice carrying the comfortable rhythm of a man used to telling stories. My grandfather came here in 1870. He had nothing. Just clothes on his back and $50 someone gave him as a parting gift. He bought 40 acres on credit and a mule. That first year, he nearly starved. The prairie is not like the old country. The summers are hotter, the winters colder, the wind never stops. But he learned. He adapted. And slowly, very slowly, the land gave back what he put into it. He paused to take a drink of water. In 1938, I went back to Germany to visit relatives. My aunt in Munich, my cousins in Stuttgart. I wanted to see the old country, wanted my children to understand their heritage. Martha's expression changed. Something sad and old crossed her face. Wilhelm continued, his voice quieter now. In Munich, the Gestapo arrested me. They thought I was Jewish because my nose is a bit crooked and I speak German with an accent they did not recognize. They held me for 3 days, beat me, broke 2 ribs and this finger. He held up his left hand showing a pinky that bent at an odd angle. When they finally realized their mistake, they let me go. No apology, no explanation. Just you are free to leave. The kitchen had gone completely silent. Even the sounds of eating had stopped. Wilhelm looked at Greta directly. I came back to America with bruises that took weeks to heal and a question I could not answer. How could the country of Goethe and Beethoven do this? How could the people who gave the world philosophy and music and science become so cruel? Greta felt tears running down her face. She didn't try to stop them. Martha reached across the table and took her hand. When the war started, Martha said softly, Wilhelm wanted to hate all Germans, wanted to think of you as the enemy. But I told him the people who hurt you are not the same as the girl who served us coffee in that cafe in Stuttgart, are not the same as the old woman who helped me find my way when I got lost in Munich. The government is not the people. The people are just people trying to live. She squeezed Greta's hand. So when they asked for volunteers to host prisoners, to show them how we farm, Wilhelm said yes, not because he forgot what happened to him, but because he remembered. And he chose not to let hate win. Greta couldn't speak, couldn't even begin to form words around the thing that was breaking open inside her chest. Beside her, Liesel was crying openly, tears dripping onto her untouched plate. Several other women had their heads bowed, shoulders shaking. Wilhelm cleared his throat. Enough sadness. Eat. The chicken will get cold, and Martha will be insulted. Martha smiled through her own tears. Wilhelm is right. Eat. We have plenty. In this house, there is always plenty. So they ate. And for a while, the kitchen was just a kitchen, women sharing a meal, the clink of forks on plates, the sound of people chewing, normal things that felt miraculous because they were normal. After lunch, Wilhelm took them back outside to show them the fields. He explained crop rotation in detail, walking them through the 3-year cycle. Showed them where the soybeans had been planted last year and now returned to corn. Explained how the roots of different plants took different nutrients, and how by rotating you kept the soil healthy and productive. He talked about mechanization, about how the tractor had changed everything, about hybrid seeds and the agricultural extension service and the government programs that helped small farmers afford new equipment. He talked with passion and precision, and Greta realized she was learning more practical agriculture in 2 hours than she had in 4 years of listening to her father's theoretical lectures. The other women asked questions, good questions, practical questions. How deep to plant? How much water? What about pests? What about weeds? Wilhelm answered everything patiently, and Greta translated, her voice growing hoarse from the constant back and forth. But she didn't mind. This felt important, felt like something that mattered beyond the war, beyond nations, beyond all the things that had seemed so critical just weeks ago. At one point, she looked back toward the truck and saw Katerina writing in a small notebook, writing fast with the intense focus of someone documenting evidence. Their eyes met across the distance. Katerina's expression was cold and knowing. She held up the notebook slightly as if to say, I am keeping track. I am remembering everything. Greta turned back to Wilhelm, but the joy had leaked out of the afternoon, because she understood now what Katerina was doing. She was making a list. Names, places, details. Everything that could be used later when Germany rose again, when retribution came, when those who had collaborated with the enemy needed to be punished. And Greta's name would be at the top of that list. The afternoon wore on. Wilhelm showed them the silo where corn was stored, tall as a church steeple and full to bursting. Showed them the barn where the harvester waited for next week's cutting. Showed them everything with the open generosity of someone who had nothing to hide. As the sun began to lower, Martha called them back to the house for one more thing, coffee and pie. She had made 3 pies while they were out in the fields. Rhubarb apple and something she called chess pie, which was just sugar and eggs and butter baked into something that tasted like concentrated sweetness. They sat on the porch eating pie and drinking real coffee, watching the sun paint the fields gold. Wilhelm talked about his children, all grown now, scattered across America. 2 sons in the military, 1 daughter teaching school in California, 1 son farming in Iowa. They wrote letters every week. They were doing well. I am luckier than I deserve, Wilhelm said quietly. I have land. I have food. I have family who are safe. And I have peace. Even in the middle of war here, I have peace. The truck engine started. Time to go. The women stood reluctantly, thanking Martha and Wilhelm in quiet voices. Martha hugged each one, even the ones who barely spoke English, even the ones who had sat silent through the meal, too overwhelmed to eat. When she came to Greta, she held on a little longer. You remind me of my daughter, she whispered in German, smart and stubborn. Do not let anyone make you small. Do not let anyone tell you that learning is betrayal. Greta nodded against her shoulder, unable to speak. The ride back to camp was different from the ride out. The women talked now, processing what they had seen, comparing notes, asking each other questions. All except Katerina's group, who sat in angry silence. Halfway back, Katerina spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. They bought you with food, with kindness, but it is still propaganda. Do not forget who we are. Do not forget our duty. Greta turned to face her. Our duty to what, Katerina? To a government that let us starve while telling us we were winning, to a Reich that sent us to die and then forgot about us. What exactly is our duty now? Katharina's face went white with rage. For a moment, Greta thought she would be slapped again. But Liesel moved between them, her voice sharp. Enough, both of you. Save your strength for something that matters. They rode the rest of the way in silence. But as the camp came into view, its barbed wire gleaming in the late sun, Greta felt something shifting inside her. A decision forming, still shapeless but growing stronger. That night after dinner, after the long shadows had given way to full dark, Sergeant Weber found Greta sitting alone by the fence. Walk with me, he said. They walked the perimeter, staying just inside the wire. Weber didn't speak for a long time. Finally, he stopped and looked at her. You're in danger, he said. Not from us, from your own people. Katerina is planning something. I do not know what, but I see how she looks at you. Like you are the enemy. Greta nodded slowly. I know. I have a proposal. Weber's voice was careful. We want to start classes. Agricultural education for any prisoners who want to learn. Techniques, statistics, practical knowledge. Things you could use if you ever go home. Things that could help rebuild. He paused. I want you to teach it. You speak both languages. You understand both the science and the practice now. You could be the bridge. Greta stared at him. You want me to teach German prisoners American agricultural methods while we are still at war? Weber nodded. I know how it sounds, but the war will end. Maybe this year, maybe next. And when it does, Germany will need to be rebuilt. The people will need to eat. Someone will have to teach them how. Why not you? Because Greta said slowly, Katerina will call it treason. She will make sure everyone knows. And when we go back, if we go back, I will be punished for it. Maybe. Weber's voice was gentle. Or maybe by the time you go back, things will have changed enough that truth is valued more than ideology. Greta looked out at the dark prairie. Somewhere out there, corn was growing. Wheat was ripening. The land was doing what it always did, regardless of human conflict. Feeding those who knew how to work with it, refusing to care about nationalism or pride or any of the things people killed each other over. Yes, she said finally, I will teach. Weber smiled in the darkness. Good. We will start next week. I will get you materials. Notebook, chalk, a blackboard. And I will make sure you are protected. He started to walk back toward the barracks, then stopped. One more thing. There is a woman in Munich, Marie Kessler. She has been trying to send letters to you through the Red Cross. I pulled some strings. This should arrive next week. He handed her an envelope. Even in the dim light, Greta could see her name written in Marie's familiar handwriting. She clutched it to her chest. Thank you. Weber nodded and walked away, leaving her alone with the letter and the night and the decision she had just made. She opened the envelope carefully. The letter inside was short, written on thin paper that had been folded and refolded many times. Dearest Greta, Munich is gone. Not completely, but mostly. The firebombing in July took our neighborhood. Mother and father are dead. I am alive barely. Little Anna asks for bread every day. I have none to give her. She is 4 years old and does not remember what butter tastes like. The ration is 200 grams of bread per day, and even that is mostly sawdust. We are told victory is near. We are told to sacrifice. But Greta, I am so tired of sacrificing. I am so tired of being hungry. If you are eating even as a prisoner, I am glad. At least one of us should remember what food tastes like. Your friend always, Marie. Greta read it 3 times each time, feeling something inside her break and reform into a new shape. Marie's daughter didn't know what butter tasted like. While Greta had eaten pie on a porch and learned about crop rotation, the guilt was crushing, but underneath it something else, something that felt almost like purpose. She folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. Tomorrow she would start preparing to teach, would start organizing everything she had learned into lessons that could be shared, would start building something from the ruins of everything she had believed. Katerina would fight her. That was certain. The division in the camp would deepen. That was inevitable. But for the first time since her capture, since her father's death, since the world had tilted off its axis, Greta felt like she was moving towards something instead of just away from everything. She walked back to the barracks slowly, the letter pressed against her heart. Inside, women were settling for the night, some praying, some writing letters, some just lying in the darkness, waiting for tomorrow. Greta climbed into her narrow cot and stared at the ceiling. In her mind, she was already planning the first lesson: how to start, what to say, how to make them understand that this was not betrayal but survival, not collaboration but wisdom. The corn had been just the beginning. Tomorrow the real work would start. And somewhere in the darkness, Katerina was planning too, planning how to stop her, how to punish her, how to make sure that when they returned to Germany, if they returned, there would be a reckoning. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, Greta had a letter from a friend who was starving and a promise to teach women how to feed a nation. It would have to be enough. The oak tree stood at the eastern edge of the camp, old and gnarled, its branches spreading wide enough to shade 20 people from the relentless Kansas sun. It had been there long before the camp, before the war, probably before Kansas was even a state. Now it served a new purpose. Beneath its branches, Margaret Fisher stood in front of a salvaged blackboard, piece of chalk in hand, facing 15 German women who sat on the ground in a loose semicircle. It was October now, 2 months since that first bite of corn, 2 months since everything she believed had started coming apart. The morning air carried the first hint of autumn cool, though by afternoon the heat would return with a vengeance. Greta had been awake since 4, preparing for this moment. Her first class, her first attempt to turn everything she had learned into something teachable. Sergeant Weber stood at a distance, rifle slung over his shoulder, but posture relaxed. He was there for protection, not intimidation. Everyone understood that. 20 yards away near the barracks, Katerina Vogel stood with her 6 remaining followers, watching with the cold intensity of a hanging judge. She had opposed these classes from the beginning, had called them collaboration, indoctrination, treason. But she could not stop them. Camp regulations allowed educational activities. The commandant had approved. So Katerina could only watch and wait and document everything in that small notebook she carried everywhere now. Greta picked up the chalk. Her hand trembled slightly. She steadied it against the board. In Germany, she began in clear German, speaking to the women, but aware that Katerina was listening too. We were taught that corn was animal feed, fodder for livestock, something beneath the dignity of civilized people. I believe this. My father, a professor of agricultural science, believed this. We were wrong. She wrote on the board in bold letters, United States corn production 1944, 2.8 billion bushels. Beneath it, German rye production, 1944, 200 grams per person per day. One woman, whose name was Elizabeth, raised her hand tentatively. But Frau Fischer, corn is still just corn. It cannot change the outcome of a war. Greta turned to face her. Cannot it? Let me ask you something. An army needs food, soldiers need calories, tanks need fuel, factories need workers who are not starving. America produces enough corn to feed 400 million people. Their population is 140 million. Where does the rest go? She wrote more numbers. Corn oil for factories, corn syrup for food preservation, corn starch for explosives, ethanol from corn for industrial alcohol, animal feed that produces meat, eggs, milk. All from one crop, all from something we dismissed as primitive. The numbers tell a story, she continued. They tell us that while we were perfecting our theories about racial superiority and Lebensraum, America was perfecting the ability to feed itself and half the world. While we were burning books, they were breeding better seeds. While we were marching, they were mechanizing. We thought we were superior. We were wrong. The words came easier now, flowing like water that had been dammed too long. She talked about hybrid seeds, about the revolution that began in the 1920s when American scientists learned to crossbreed corn varieties, about yields that doubled in 20 years, about farmers who went from bare subsistence to prosperity in a single generation. Liesl Hartmann listened with fierce attention, occasionally taking notes on a scrap of paper. 2 other women did the same. The rest simply absorbed their faces, showing the same mix of fascination and discomfort that Greta herself had felt 2 months ago. From the direction of the barracks, Katerina's voice carried clearly. Listen to her, the great professor's daughter, teaching us to admire the enemy. How proud her father would be. Greta's hand tightened on the chalk, but she did not turn around, did not take the bait. Instead, she continued as if she had not heard. My father would have hated this, she said quietly. He believed in German exceptionalism, in the superiority of our science, our culture, our race. He was a brilliant man. He was also blind, blind to what was happening in the world outside his theories. She paused, looking at each woman in turn. We have a choice. We can be like him. We can cling to our pride while the world moves past us, or we can open our eyes. We can learn. We can take this knowledge back to Germany when the war ends and use it to feed our people. Because make no mistake, Germany will need feeding. The cities are rubble. The farms are destroyed. When we return, if we return, someone will need to know how to rebuild. Why should that someone not be us? The class lasted 2 hours. Greta covered crop rotation, explaining how alternating corn, soybeans, and wheat restored nutrients to soil instead of depleting it. She talked about mechanization, about how a single combine harvester did the work of 50 people. She drew diagrams of proper planting, depth, and spacing. She shared everything the Schmidts had taught her, everything she had learned in the demonstration garden, everything Weber had explained about American agricultural policy. When it ended, the women stood slowly, some energized, others troubled. Elizabeth approached Greta with hesitant steps. Frau Fischer, what you are teaching us, it makes sense. But Katerina says, we will be punished when we return home. That learning from the enemy is collaboration. Greta looked past Elizabeth to where Katerina still stood, notebook open, writing. Katerina is afraid, Greta said simply. Afraid that if we learn, if we change, it means everything she believed was a lie. And maybe it was, but that is not our fault. We did not start this war. We did not create the lies. We just believed them. Now we have a chance to believe something true. What we do with that chance is up to us. Elizabeth nodded slowly and walked away. But Greta saw the doubt in her eyes, the fear, and she understood it, because she felt it too. Every day, every lesson, every moment she stood under this tree and taught American methods to German women, she was stepping further from the person she used to be, further from safety, further from the certainty that had once defined her entire world. That night, the inevitable confrontation came. Greta was sitting on her cot reviewing notes for tomorrow's lesson when Katerina entered the barracks with 3 of her followers. The other women immediately went quiet, sensing danger. Katerina walked straight to Greta's bunk and stood over her. You think you are so clever, Katerina said, her voice low and venomous. Teaching your little classes, playing professor. But I see what you are doing. You are destroying everything we fought for. Greta set down her notebook and looked up. What did we fight for, Katerina? Tell me. Because I have forgotten. Katerina's face flushed red. For the fatherland, for Germany, for our future. Our future, Greta stood, bringing them eye to eye. Our future is ashes, Katerina. Berlin is being bombed every night. Our armies are in retreat. Our people are starving. What future are you defending? The one where we all die proud and hungry, or the one where we swallow our pride and learn how to survive? You dare, Katerina hissed. You dare speak of Germany's defeat as if it is certain. It is certain. Greta's voice was quiet but firm. Anyone who has eyes can see it. We lost. Not because we were not brave enough, not because we did not sacrifice enough. We lost because we were wrong about everything, about who we were, about what we deserved, about the world we tried to conquer. Katerina slapped her, the same sharp crack as before. But this time Greta did not flinch, did not touch her reddening cheek. She simply stood there, looking at Katerina with something like pity. Is that all you have left, violence, because ideas terrify you now? Katerina's hand moved again, but Liesel stepped between them, her nurse's authority cutting through the tension like a scalpel. Enough, Katerina. You hit her once before. We let it pass. Not again. If you touch her again, I will report you to the Americans myself. Katerina looked around the barracks. Of the 20 women present, only 3 still stood with her. The rest had moved to form a loose protective circle around Greta. The shift in power was visible, tangible. Katerina saw it, and something in her face changed. The anger remained, but underneath it now was something else. Desperation. "You are all traitors," she said, her voice breaking. "All of you. When we return to Germany, when the Reich rises again, you will all answer for this." Liesel's voice was gentle but unyielding. "Katerina, the Reich is not rising again. It is falling. It is already fallen. The only question now is what we do with what remains." Katerina turned and walked out of the barracks, her followers trailing behind. The door slammed. The women stood in silence for a long moment. Then someone began to cry. Quiet, exhausted crying. The sound of something finally breaking that had been cracked for too long. Greta sat back down on her cot, suddenly trembling. Liesel sat beside her and took her hand. "You made an enemy today," the nurse said quietly. "A dangerous one. I made an enemy 2 months ago when I ate corn and admitted it tasted good." Greta's laugh was shaky. "At least now, we all know where we stand." The classes continued through October and into November. The group grew, 20 women now, then 25. Even some who had initially sided with Katerina began attending quietly, sitting at the back, taking notes they tried to hide. Greta taught them everything, not just farming techniques, but the philosophy behind them. The American belief that abundance was possible, that cooperation with nature worked better than domination, that sharing knowledge made everyone stronger instead of weaker. She taught them to make cornbread, the women copying recipes onto scraps of paper, with the reverence usually reserved for prayer books. She taught them about soil composition and nitrogen fixation. She taught them the economics of mechanization, explaining how tractors paid for themselves in 3 seasons of improved yields. She taught until her voice was hoarse and her hands were stained with chalk dust. And slowly, imperceptibly, at first something shifted in the camp. The women began to stand differently, walk differently. They started asking questions, not just about corn, but about everything. Why had they been told lies? Who had benefited from their ignorance? What else did they not know? Where Weber watched from the sidelines, occasionally contributing information, but mostly letting Greta lead. One afternoon after class, he pulled her aside. "You are doing something dangerous," he said. "You are teaching them to think. That is more subversive than any military intelligence." "Is that a problem?" Weber smiled. "No, it is exactly what we hope for. But be careful. Katerina has not given up. She is planning something. I do not know what, but watch yourself." The warning proved prophetic. 3 nights later, Greta woke to find her bunk had been searched. Her notebooks were scattered across the floor. Pages torn, diagrams destroyed, weeks of work ruined. And on her pillow, a note in German written in Katharina's precise handwriting. "This is evidence of collaboration with the enemy. When we return to Germany, this evidence will condemn you. You cannot escape justice. You cannot outrun betrayal. The Reich remembers, the Reich will return, and you will answer." Greta sat on the floor, surrounded by torn pages, feeling something inside her harden into resolve. She gathered the papers, carefully smoothing them out. Most could be salvaged. The diagrams could be redrawn. The recipes could be rewritten. Katerina had destroyed paper, but not knowledge, had torn notes, but not understanding. Liesel found her there an hour later, still sitting among the debris. "It was Katerina," Liesel said. "It was not a question." Greta nodded. "She thinks this will stop me. She thinks fear is still stronger than truth." Liesel sat down beside her and began helping gather the scattered papers. "Is it?" Greta looked at the older woman. This nurse who had lost sons and country and faith, but somehow still had strength to offer. "No," she said quietly, "not anymore. I am done being afraid." The next morning, Greta reported the incident to Sergeant Weber. He listened with a grim expression, then made a decision. Katerina Vogel will spend 7 days in solitary confinement. Destruction of personal property, harassment, threatening behavior. 7 days. Maybe it will cool her temper. It did not cool her temper. It sharpened it. When Katerina emerged from isolation 1 week later, she looked like something carved from ice. Her face was pale, her eyes burned with the fervor of a martyr. She spoke to no one, ate mechanically, spent hours sitting alone, staring at nothing. The other women gave her a wide berth, sensing something dangerous in her silence. Greta continued teaching, but now with a shadow hanging over everything. She felt Katerina's eyes on her constantly, watching, waiting, judging. It was like living under a microscope, every move examined for evidence of betrayal. Then came December. Then came the news that changed everything. It was a cold morning, frost glittering on the barbed wire when the camp commandant called all prisoners to assembly. He stood on a small platform, a telegram in his hand, his face grave. "Ladies," he said in slow, careful German, "I have news from Europe. As of yesterday, December 16th, Germany has launched a major offensive in the Ardennes forest. Early reports suggest significant gains. The war continues." A murmur ran through the assembled women. Katerina's face blazed with vindictive joy. She turned to look at Greta with an expression of pure triumph. "You see, Germany rises. The final victory comes, and traitors will be judged." But the commandant was not finished. However, he continued, his voice cutting through the noise. "Our intelligence suggests this offensive is a last desperate gamble. Germany is using every remaining resource, every last soldier, every last tank, every last drop of fuel. Military analysts believe this is not the beginning of victory, but the final spasm before collapse." The murmur died. The silence that followed was profound. "Prepare yourselves, ladies. The war will likely end within 6 months, perhaps sooner. You should begin thinking about what comes after, about how you will rebuild, about what Germany will need from those who survive." That night, Katerina did not return to the barracks. They found her body the next morning in the isolation cell she had been held in weeks before. She had fashioned a rope from torn bed sheets and hanged herself from the ceiling beam. On the small table, a letter written in her meticulous hand. Greta was called to translate it for the commandant. Her hands shook as she read the German script. "I cannot live in a world where Germany has lost. I cannot live in a world where Margaret Fisher was right. I have served the Reich with my life. Now I serve it with my death. May those who betrayed us be judged accordingly." Katharina Vogel, officer of the Third Reich, died with honor. Greta set the letter down carefully. Her face was wet with tears she had not felt falling. "She did not have to die," she whispered. "She only had to change." The commandant's voice was gentle. "Some people cannot change, Miss Fisher. For them, their beliefs are not ideas. They are identity itself. To change would be to cease existing. So they choose death over transformation." Katerina was buried in the camp cemetery, a small plot at the far edge of the property. 7 women attended. Not Greta, not Liesel, not any of those who had taken the classes. Just the last true believers standing in the December cold, mourning not just a woman, but an entire worldview that had died with her. Greta stood at the barracks window watching from a distance. She felt no triumph, no vindication, only a profound sadness for someone who could not bend and so had broken. That evening, Sergeant Weber found her sitting under the oak tree even though it was nearly freezing. "You should not blame yourself," he said. "I do not blame myself for her choice." Greta's voice was tired. "But I wonder if I could have done something different, said something that would have reached her." Weber sat beside her on the cold ground. "Some people are beyond reaching. They have gone so far into their beliefs that the way back is too long, too hard. Katerina was one of those. She built her entire identity on German supremacy, on final victory, on the righteousness of the Reich. When those things proved false, she had nothing left. You did not do that to her. History did." They sat in silence for a while, watching the winter stars emerge. "What will you do?" Weber asked eventually, "when the war ends. When you go back." Greta looked at her hands, still stained with chalk dust from that morning's lesson. "I will go home, to whatever remains of home, and I will teach. I will find people who are willing to learn, who want to rebuild instead of refight. I will plant the seeds that Wilhelm Schmidt gave me, literally and figuratively. And maybe if I am very lucky, something will grow." Weber smiled in the darkness. "I think something already has, Miss Fisher. I think something already has." Winter deepened. The classes continued, now somber and focused. The women knew time was running short. When the war ended, they would be repatriated, sent back to a Germany they no longer recognized, if indeed any Germany remained. So they learned with desperate intensity, copied recipes, memorized planting depths, drew diagrams of 3-year crop rotations, hoarded knowledge like it was gold. In January, letters began arriving from Germany, delayed by months of wartime chaos. Greta received one from Marie. The envelope was thin, the paper inside almost transparent. Dearest Greta, as I write this, I do not know if you are alive. I do not know if this letter will reach you. But I write anyway because writing is the only thing that makes me feel human anymore. Anna died last week. Starvation. She was 4 years old. The doctor said there was nothing to be done. No food, no medicine, nothing. She died asking for bread. I have decided to live, though I do not know why. Perhaps because someone must survive to remember. Perhaps because I am too cowardly to follow her. If you are alive, Greta, if you ever come home, please find me. Please tell me that somewhere in this broken world, there is still corn growing, still butter, still something sweet. I need to believe that. Your friend. If friendship still exists, Marie. Greta read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and put it in her pocket. That afternoon's lesson was on grain storage. How to keep corn dry through winter. How to prevent mold and rot. How to make a little food last a long time. The women listened with fierce attention, understanding now in a way they had not before. This was not academic. This was survival. When class ended, Greta stood at the blackboard for a long time, staring at the diagrams of silos and storage bins. Finally, she picked up the chalk and wrote in large letters across the board. For Anna. For Marie. For all who will need feeding. She left it there. The next day, when she returned, someone had added in smaller letters beneath for our children, for the future, for Germany reborn. In February, Sergeant Weber brought news that American and Soviet forces were closing in on Berlin. The end was weeks away now, maybe days. The camp buzzed with anxious energy. What would happen to them? Where would they go? What would they find when they got there? Greta focused on what she could control. She rewrote all her notes, creating clean copies that could be easily transported. She organized the women into study groups, making sure the knowledge was distributed among many instead of held by one. She prepared them as best she could for a future she could barely imagine. On April 30th, the news came. Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war was over. The camp erupted into chaos. American soldiers cheering. German prisoners crying, some from relief, some from grief, most from confusion about what to feel. The world had ended and begun again in the same breath. Greta walked to the fence and looked out at the Kansas prairie. Spring had come while she was not paying attention. The fields were green with new growth. Corn planted weeks ago was already pushing through the soil, small green shoots full of promise. Liesel found her there. We are going home, the nurse said. Ships will leave in 2 months. Back to Germany, back to whatever remains. Greta nodded slowly. I need to visit the Schmidts before we leave. Need to say goodbye. Need to thank them. Weber arranged it, one last visit 1 week before the transports left for the coast. This time Greta went alone. Just her and Weber in the truck, driving through landscape that had become familiar over the months. She knew these roads now, knew the pattern of fields and farmhouses, knew the rhythm of this American heartland that had been so foreign 8 months ago. Wilhelm and Martha were waiting on the porch when they arrived. They looked older, Greta thought. The war had aged everyone, but their smiles were genuine, their welcome warm. They sat in the kitchen one last time. Coffee and pie. The ritual felt sacred, now weighted with meaning. Wilhelm reached under the table and pulled out a cloth bag. He set it in front of Greta. Iowa hybrid corn seeds. The best we have. I have been saving them for you. Enough to plant 2 acres. Take them home. Plant them in German soil. See if they grow. Greta opened the bag, looking at the kernels inside. They were perfect. Uniform size, healthy, full of potential. Herr Schmidt, I do not know if I will even have land to plant these in. I do not know what I will find when I go back. Martha reached across and closed Greta's hands around the bag. You will find devastation. You will find hunger. You will find people who need hope. These seeds are hope, Margarete. Hope that something can grow from nothing. Hope that knowledge can feed the hungry. Hope that the world can be better than it was. Wilhelm nodded. And if they do not grow in Germany, that is all right too. Because you are also a seed. Everything you learned here, everything you taught those women, that will grow. Maybe not this year. Maybe not next year. But eventually, seeds have patience. They wait for the right conditions. Then they burst into life when the time comes. Greta stood carefully placing the bag in her coat pocket. Then she did something she had never done before. She hugged Wilhelm Schmidt, this man who had every reason to hate Germans and instead had chosen to teach one. She hugged Martha, who had fed her and cared for her and shown her what generosity looked like even in the middle of war. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything, for corn and cornbread and kindness, for showing me that the world is bigger than my beliefs, for teaching me that learning is not betrayal, it is survival." Martha was crying now, holding Greta tight. "Go home, child. Feed your people. Teach them what you know. Make something beautiful from these terrible ashes." The ship left from New York in June. Greta stood at the rail with Liesel and 20 other women watching America recede into the distance. In her bag, carefully wrapped, were her notebooks. The recipes, the diagrams, the seeds, everything she would need to begin again. Liesel leaned against the rail beside her. "Are you afraid of what we will find?" Terrified. Greta admitted, but also hopeful, because we know something now that we did not know before. What is that? That abundance is possible, that feeding people is not harder than making war, that the soil does not care about nationality or ideology. It only cares if you know how to work with it. The crossing took 2 weeks. When they finally saw the German coast, Greta felt her heart clench. From the ship, she could see the devastation. Entire cities reduced to rubble. The ports barely functional. Everything broken. They docked in Hamburg, or what remained of Hamburg. Greta stepped onto German soil for the first time in a year and felt like a stranger in her own land. The women dispersed slowly, heading to whatever towns or villages they hoped still existed. Greta and Liesel stayed together, making their way south toward Göttingen. The journey took 3 days. Trains barely ran. Roads were cratered. They walked much of the way through a landscape that looked like the end of the world. And everywhere people. Displaced. Starving. Desperate. In a small town whose name Greta never learned, they saw children begging for food. Actual children, 8 or 9 years old, so thin their ribs showed through their shirts. Greta stopped, reached into her bag, pulled out half of her remaining rations, and gave them to a little girl with hollow eyes. The girl ate like an animal, cramming the bread into her mouth, terrified someone would take it away. When she finished, she looked at Greta with something like worship. "Are you an angel?" the child asked. "No," Greta said gently, "just someone who knows what it is like to be hungry, and someone who knows how to make sure you do not have to stay hungry forever." She turned to Liesel. "This is what we came back for. These children, this hunger, this need." They reached Göttingen 5 days after landing. The university where her father had taught was partially destroyed. The neighborhood where she grew up was rubble, but the agricultural faculty building still stood damaged but functional. And in the office of the department head, Greta found a man she recognized. Professor Steiner, her father's colleague, now old and tired, but still working. He looked at her in shock. "Margaret Fisher, we thought you were dead." "I was a prisoner. In America, I have come back to help rebuild." She opened her bag and spread her notebooks on his desk. The recipes, the agricultural techniques, the statistics, the diagrams of hybrid corn and crop rotation and mechanical harvesting. Steiner read in silence for a long time. Finally, he looked up. "This is American methodology." "Yes, your father would have been horrified." Greta met his eyes steadily. "My father was wrong about many things, as were we all. But we have a choice now. We can cling to our pride and starve, or we can learn from those who know better and survive. Which do you choose?" Professor Steiner looked at the notebooks again, at the careful diagrams and detailed instructions, at the evidence of months of dedicated learning. "I choose survival," he said quietly. "When can you start teaching?" "Immediately." And so it began. In the ruins of the Third Reich, in the bombed-out cities and starving countryside, Greta Fisher began to teach. Not grand lectures about racial destiny or Lebensraum, but practical lessons about corn and wheat and soybeans, about crop rotation and hybrid seeds and mechanical harvesting, about feeding people instead of ideologies. The students were mostly women at first. Men who survived the war were too traumatized, too broken. But the women came. Women who had lost husbands and sons, women who needed to know how to feed their children, women who were ready to learn from the enemy if it meant survival. Greta taught them everything Wilhelm Schmidt had taught her, everything Weber had explained, everything she had learned under that oak tree in Kansas. She taught with passion and precision, and slowly, things began to grow. In the spring of 1946, she planted Wilhelm's corn seeds in a small plot behind the agricultural building. 20 other women helped her following the instructions she had memorized. Proper depth, proper spacing, proper soil preparation. The corn grew. Not as tall as in Kansas, not as robust, but it grew. And when it was ready, Greta showed the women how to harvest it, how to prepare it, how to turn it from a plant into food that could sustain life. They roasted ears over an improvised grill, just like that first night in Camp Concordia. The smell brought Greta to tears. The women ate tentatively at first, then with growing enthusiasm. "It is sweet," one of them said in wonder. "How is it so sweet?" "Because it was bred to be," Greta explained. "Because someone somewhere decided that food should not just sustain but delight, that even in the middle of hardship there should be sweetness." News of her work spread. By 1948, she was advising farms across Bavaria. By 1950, she was working with the new government's agricultural ministry, helping to implement American farming techniques across West Germany. The hybrid seeds, the crop rotation, the mechanization, all of it. She wrote letters to Wilhelm and Martha Schmidt regularly, sent them updates on the corn, on the students, on the slow rebuilding of a nation that had nearly destroyed itself. They wrote back with encouragement and advice, and more seeds when she needed them. In 1955, at the invitation of the West German government, Wilhelm and Martha Schmidt visited Germany. They toured farms that were using the techniques they had taught, saw corn growing in soil that had once only known rye, met farmers who could finally feed their families without hunger hanging over every meal. And they met Greta, now 39 years old, gray, starting to streak her hairlines around her eyes from years of squinting at crop rows. She met them at the train station in Frankfurt, older now, but still Wilhelm and Martha still carrying that quality of generous strength. They embraced in the middle of the platform, three people who had been on opposite sides of a terrible war and had chosen instead to be on the same side of survival. "Come," Greta said, "I want to show you what you planted." She took them to her farm, not large, just 40 acres, but productive, organized. Corn in one field, wheat in another, soybeans in the third. The 3-year rotation Wilhelm had taught her now implemented and thriving. Tractors in the barn purchased with government loans. Silos full of grain. Abundance where there had been devastation. Wilhelm walked through the corn rows, touching the stalks, examining the ears. When he turned back, his face was wet with tears. "This," he said quietly, "this is what we hoped for. Not that you would copy us, but that you would learn from us. Take what worked and make it yours. This is how the world heals, not through force, not through conquest, but through sharing, through teaching, through corn that grows in soil that does not care who owns it." That evening, they sat together in Greta's small farmhouse, drinking coffee that was real, now eating cornbread that Greta had learned to make from Martha's original recipe. And Greta told them about Katerina, about the women who had learned and those who had refused, about the slow, painful transformation from enemy to student to teacher. Some people could not make the journey, she said, could not let go of what they believed long enough to learn something new. I think about Katerina often. Wonder if I could have reached her somehow. Martha shook her head. "Margaret, you cannot save those who do not want saving. You can only hold the door open and hope they walk through." Katerina chose to stay in the room that was burning. That was her choice, not your failure. Wilhelm raised his coffee cup. "To those who walk through the door, to those who chose learning over certainty, to seeds that grow in unexpected soil." They clinked cups together. Coffee instead of wine, simple instead of grand, but profound in its own way. Greta's farm became a teaching center. Students came from across Germany to learn the American methods that had transformed barren land into productivity. She taught for years, eventually training a whole generation of agricultural scientists who had never known the Third Reich, who had no memory of the hunger years, who took abundance for granted. One day in 1960, a young woman came to study, 17 years old, bright-eyed, eager. Her name was Anna. She had been named, her mother explained, after a cousin who died in the war. Greta looked at the girl and saw the future. Saw someone who would never have to choose between pride and survival, who would grow up in a Germany that had learned the hard way that feeding people was more important than feeding ideology. She taught Anna everything she knew, and when the girl graduated and went to start her own farm, Greta gave her a gift, a small bag of corn seeds, descendants of the ones Wilhelm had given her 15 years ago. These seeds have a history, Greta said. They traveled from Iowa to Kansas to Germany. They survived war and hate and devastation. They are more than just seeds. They are a promise that even in the darkest times, something can grow. Anna took the bag reverently. What should I do with them? Plant them, Greta said. And when they grow, save some seeds and give them to someone else who needs hope. Pass it forward. That is how we heal. One seed, one field, one person at a time. Years later in 1987, Greta Fischer sat in her garden in Göttingen. She was 71 now, retired from active teaching, but still consulting occasionally. The garden was full of corn, not because she needed it, but because she loved it. Loved the way it grew tall and proud. Loved the way the ears filled out heavy with kernels. Loved what it represented. Her granddaughter, 12-year-old Anna II, named after her great-great-aunt, came running through the corn rows. Oma, why do you grow so much corn? We cannot possibly eat it all. Greta smiled, pulling the girl onto her lap, even though Anna was getting too big for such things. I grow it because it reminds me of something important. A long time ago, I thought I knew everything. Thought my people, my country, my way of life was superior to everyone else. Then I was captured in a war we started and lost. And an American soldier offered me corn. Just corn. And that one bite changed my entire world. She paused, looking out over the rows of green stalks. The real enemy, Anna, is never other people. The real enemy is ignorance, pride, the refusal to learn. The corn taught me that. It taught me that abundance is possible if you are willing to learn from those who know better. That feeding people is more important than feeding hate. That a seed is just a seed until you plant it, but once you plant it, it can change everything. Anna looked up at her grandmother with solemn eyes. Did you save the world? Oma Greta laughed. No, child. I just learned to grow corn. But maybe that is the same thing. Maybe the world is saved one field at a time. One lesson. One person willing to admit they were wrong and learn something new. I learned from Wilhelm Schmidt. I taught others. They taught more. And now Germany is fed. Not because we conquered anyone, but because we finally learned to listen. She stood, joints creaking, and took Anna's hand. Come, let me show you how to tell when corn is ready to harvest. You need to learn this. Someday you may need to teach it to someone else. They walked through the corn together, grandmother and granddaughter, through rows that whispered in the wind, through abundance that had been bought with humility and paid for with pride. The sun was setting, painting the corn gold, making it look like treasure. And in a way it was. Not the corn itself, but what it represented. The willingness to change, the courage to admit error, the strength to learn from enemies and turn them into teachers. Greta Fischer had gone to war believing in German superiority and come home believing in human potential. Had left believing in conquest and returned believing in cultivation. Had departed certain and arrived curious. All because of corn. All because one sergeant offered one ear to one prisoner and said, just try it. Just one bite, that is all I ask. One bite had changed everything. And the seeds of that change were still growing, still spreading, still teaching those willing to learn that the world is bigger than belief, that truth matters more than ideology, and that sometimes the greatest victories come not from fighting, but from planting. The corn grew tall in the German soil, and Margareta Fischer, once prisoner, once student, once teacher, watched it grow and knew that some wars are won, not with weapons, but with seeds. And that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.